I'd like to now invite Laura to join us back in the panel. And I will start, with some of the questions that are coming up, and I'll, use up. I'll throw them in by order of popularity. The first one, and I think maybe you can start, Laura, is what it comes from Rifle Manira Kisa, and it reads, what kind of simple tasks can be assigned to our clients who cannot read nor write?
Yeah. So that was what we had to really contend with in regards to that Karen refugee study that we did, where we were actually on the phone continuously trying to work out what we could accommodate. It was all done with an interpreter. We used a lot more drawings, a lot more just discussion rather than, we had all these forms that people were going to fill out. We had to they weren't necessary, they weren't right to give. And so we actually ended up doing a lot more drawing, a lot more speaking, a lot more as a group. It was quite interesting, even when we were doing the assessments. We had this plan, obviously, that we're going to assess each participant individually. And the group was like, we don't want to do it individually. We want to do it as a group. So we would ask all the questions that we know. Do you feel depressed? Do you feel depressed? Do you feel depressed? And it was actually interesting even that process, because we looked at so many of our assessments and so much of it is overlapped. So many of our assessments ask whether someone can sleep or not. It's actually quite frustrating. And so it was a real learning curve of how we modified things. But a lot of it, given it wasn't written, we had to keep scrapping things and readjusting things as we went along, readjusting what our expectations were and thinking what is it that we're trying to deliver and keeping hold of that and getting rid of the other stuff that isn't needed. And so it was using pictures, using drama, using different modalities.
Thank you, Laura. Janet, anything that you'd like to add in connection to this question?
Oh, most definitely. I think, Laura, you've really highlighted our daily work at STARTS, that we work with people who've had no formal education and who always with interpreters and interpreters over the phone. And often the way that the interpreters give feedback about doing those kinds of assessments with people from communities where they're not written in their own language, and so not culturally validated language. So I'm interpreting from English through an interpreter and asking the client to try and ascertain the symptomology and really get some of their story as well, which is helpful in that process. Is that you've already asked this question, and didn't I give you that answer? And perhaps and then the answer is the same. So yes, trickiness around validity, I'd say, but meaningful feedback from working one-on-one with individuals about their personal experience, and some helpfulness with engagement if it can be done in a very empathetic way.
Okay. Thank you for that. I have another really interesting question coming from Robin Bowles, a good friend and ex-colleague from STARTS for many years. And it reads, it could be argued that the way that most women focus on events is more in the collective fashion, focusing on others. I think that culture is far more complex and diverse and changing than just Western and Eastern. Could you talk a little bit about this complexity in your research? Laura, would you like to start?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think when we always start our projects, we start with culture, and then we have this probably 2-hour debate about how we're going to look at it, how we're going to study it. One of the works that we were actually doing, where we got funding for, where we were going to look at East Asian, and we had the Japanese community, the Chinese community, and Korean community. That's what we're going to focus on. And the feedback was like, how dare you collapse us across? We're not the same. And so we went back and we thought, okay, this is our error. This is not the way to do things. And so we just focused on one community, and we got a lot of all our projects are led by people from those communities, so it gets those nuances. I also agree that's where a lot of our research is starting to go to, because it's more about cultural values rather than persons from cultural X or cultural Y. It's much more complex, as the question suggested, in terms of gender too, and intersectionality between gender and culture. And so we're really just scraping the top of it, and I absolutely acknowledge the complexities at the next levels down that need to be thought through. And I guess our research is very much like, it's not the person's from person X and this is what we need to do. It's more, well, how do we actually start thinking through this in a more complex way?
Thank you, Laura. And I might throw in another complexity, which is very pertinent to our work here in Australia, which is that of cultural transition. You know, people are transitioning, through culture, becoming acculturated into Australia, and that throws another level of complexity. Would you like to comment on that? And I'd certainly like to hear from Janet on this after as well.
Yeah, no, that is that also becomes in our discussions of how we define culture, because the experiences of someone who's second generation, first generation, there's some really amazing studies too that obviously, and it's a real strength for people to have multiple identities too. And you often see that people can pull out those different identities. Even speaking different languages will pull out different cultural identities in people, which is a real strength. And I think a lot of it isn't even really understood that well at this point. But I agree that moving to a different culture, the stresses of moving to a different culture all compound that as well. And it's hard to make. Most of the work we've been doing is looking at people who have moved within the last 7 years to try and reduce or focus more clearly on that. But there are other issues focused on generations, and that's often discussed even within our sort of research group for people who are from those different communities and been here X amount of time or different amount of time, and how that impacts as well. So yeah, that is also definitely worth considering and makes it more complex.
I can see a lot more research coming into this area. Janet, anything that you'd like to throw in from your side, from your experience in working, particularly,
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This is always a component of the work that we're doing as well. It's that stresses of the adjustment and the stresses of the change and the new, and how they affect people of different ages and stages and different capacities to embrace a new language and to link in with others who are local here in Australia as opposed to people from the original culture. And these things are often compound the other traumas, and I think it's well represented by the formulation model that we use in STARTS, which is that picture of Australia with all the arrows and circles that I had up. But I'd also like to just say something about gender too, that just working with the Yazidi, elements of educational background, which are culturally, role. Many women didn't get an opportunity to have an extensive education, depending on whether they're from a more rural or a more urban background. And perhaps men did, perhaps they were out in the world more. They also, expanded their language repertoire where they came from, and perhaps more used to communicating outside the home. And all of those sorts of things, all of those cultural differences, they're impactful on how people process trauma, whether they're thinking globally about the place of the politics, or whether they're thinking really within the sphere of the home and how it works and how they care. All of these things are very impactful. So it's multiple intersections.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question, which comes from Selena Wong Ellery. And this reads, can you speak a little bit about written exposure therapy and expressive writing therapy? Are they similar? Are there any major differences between them? Laura, again, I think if you could start with this one.
Yeah, I guess they are similar. I guess a lot of it comes from the same basis of exposing yourself to the memory and writing about it. Mm-hmm. The written exposure therapy sort of builds on Penny Baker's sort of work, and also some of the work that the Child and War Foundation did, Writing for Recovery. It's basically, it is the same where you're exposing yourself to the memory by writing about it in a more low intensity sort of way. So it's simply the people, the participants or clients come and they write about it for 30 minutes and then they leave and then they come back. If people are interested, Denise Sloan has done some really nice work on this. It's come a lot out of the US and she's got a book on it. In her work, she does it more for 60 minutes, whereas for adolescents, that's just too long to sit. The one thing I would say about the written exposure, there's a few things that we have learnt in our work too. We did do it with adolescents, which based on the World Health Organization was 10 to 19. It was too young. The younger adolescents struggled with it. So I would say it should be something that's targeted a little bit higher as well. But yeah, it is basically similar sort of processes of telling that story, writing about it, putting your thoughts, your feelings, situation into it, and starting to tell it as a story as well.
Thank you. Janet, would you like to comment on this one? Or shall we move on to, maybe let's move on to maybe the next one, which I think, if we can start with you in this one. It comes from Bina O'Sullivan, and it reads, clients can be reluctant to share personal trauma histories. For some, it is a trigger that they're not ready to experience. For others, it is an issue of trust, and for others, they want to move on and not dwell in the past. In your experience, what are your thoughts on this reluctance to share painful experiences, and whether this is related to the numbing of memory?
Sorry, is that directed to me? Yes. So definitely, the process of counselling is all about building rapport, building trust, creating that safe place where somebody feels comfortable to be exposed and to be able to speak. Sometimes I've also, particularly from the Yazidi and some other people from more collectivist cultures, who apologise if they don't want to upset me with the distress that they know that their story gives. And they are aware of this transmission of emotion, and they don't want to. They feel some responsibility for that, and that's part of that process. So some reassurance about how I'm able to hold that, and that I've got experience at doing that, and that I look after myself and in order so that I can help them is sometimes helpful in that process. I think also the reluctance can be because of shame, because of embarrassment, or because of some feeling that it's going to be so overwhelming, and how they behave at that moment might be very confronting and difficult for them. So it's just being aware of these things, and I suppose finding some starting points, even if they're from different places. And then people do open up. I find that they do.
Thank you. Laura, anything you'd like to comment on this reluctance to open it up that we see many of our clients, and experience or what research tells us about how to address this issue?
Yeah, it is an important question. I think Jeanette did a great job in answering that one. I guess in the clinical work I've done as well, it's sort of reflecting on myself, whether I'm also trying to avoid it, because often clients come in and they're so clients I've worked with in the UK that were from the Congo, and they would say, well, actually my parenting is the first thing that I want to talk about, and then this, and then trauma, and then everything would keep pushing the trauma down. And it was always a reflection on me and on the work, and whether we're all avoiding this trauma, or is it that, and these are the priorities. And so it was always, I guess, going to supervision was always really important in that too. But it was also reflecting on me as a clinician and my sort of stance. But then when people did start talking about it, I agree, people are willing to share that story once they have that trust and rapport. And I do agree too, they're sort of often watching you like a hawk to see how you're going to respond, because they don't want to put you out or to make you too upset, or because it is a thing that you don't often share with people, and it is quite upsetting to share. So, I agree with the points that were previously said. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question comes from Pearl Fernandez, and refers to the research that has evaluated efficacy of ethnocultural approaches to managing trauma. And Pearl wonders whether there's a reason why cognitive-based interventions and the dominant approaches have been the dominant approaches to be evaluated and received attention from researchers who accept diversity, multiculturalism. So it's why that broader look at research. Laura, is this something that you'd like to comment on?
Can you just repeat a bit of the question? Sorry, I just cut out a little bit.
Sure.
Do you mind to repeat?
Yep. Is there a reason why cognitive-based interventions are the dominant approaches to be evaluated and receive attention from researchers who accept diversity and multiculturalism?
So cognitive approaches. Yeah, I guess I guess that's where the fields really come from, was the cognitive and exposure-based interventions. But there's been a lot more argument in the research more recently. A lot of the cognitive interventions are very much about just the individual, and there's work by Andres Merker and others that obviously trauma just never impacts an individual. It impacts on family, communities, more broadly, and so there's more push for that. I think there is a push for other modalities in regards to trauma-focused sort of work, in regards to art or music. I just don't think it's had the same funding and the same research push in the research. But I think, as clinicians, people know what works and what doesn't, but sometimes there hasn't been as much the focus in the research. But yeah, I guess that's my just thoughts on it initially.
Thank you. I'd like to take us now to the next question, which explores how this applies to children. It reads, several of my young people clients with high level of trauma symptoms have distinct memories, positive and negative, of autobiographical events. I'm wondering if that is due to the stage of development. Who'd like to go first? Yep, thanks, Laura. Yep.
I'm not an expert in child.
Yep.
Much more my work is clinically and as a researcher has been more with adults. The memory specificity and the difficulties of memory, though, we have seen in adolescents. We've seen it in war-exposed adolescents. We've done the first actually trials in the memory specificity sort of work we've done actually with adolescents in Afghanistan and refugees, actually Afghan refugees who are in Iran. So it is, and there's some work that has been shown, a meta-analysis sort of shown that it is shown in children as well, having trouble providing specific memory, and then going through development. I mean, I feel hesitant to speak on this because I'm not a developmental psychologist, and that's not my area, but there is differences in how, I think because PTSD is such a verbal and cognitive, there are going to be developmental differences in how it's expressed. But there are similar disruptions in trauma memories, even in children. Often you see this time skew where it's not sort of chronological, or there's gaps, or there's this omen formation where children believe that something happened that you also see in adults, but believe something that somehow protected them. So I guess the memory work in trauma, and it's interesting, the child PTSD literature is even further behind, and there's very few studies on the culture, trauma, and the child sort of work. So that is a space that still is needed.
Again, another area for future research, and certainly I think there's so much in this. Janet, anything that you'd like to comment on this question?
I think I do. At STARTS, we work with children and adolescents. We have specialists, and in rural areas where I am, we work with adults and children, and have that experience of working with children. A lot of responses that involve some kind of activity that's all about engagement, and a lot of things that are more to do with activities that might be to do with ways of breathing associated with animals, or relaxation strategies that are associated with getting into little different postures and things like that. So activity-based things are all about how to engage children in this process, rather than discussions and cognitive thinking and challenging. Perhaps for older adolescents, some of that works well. But in my work, I would default all the time to activities, art, music, all those other things.
That I'd like to, next most upvoted question is from Lillian Harmon, and it reads, I am very interested in the occurrence of traditional cleansing rituals to help survivors who have been forced into acts of atrocity to reintegrate into community, like the one that you described for Yazidi women, Janet, and which have also occurred in some African countries for helping child soldiers reintegrate. Is there any research on the role of collective cultural cleansing rituals in mediating PTSD symptoms? Or in alleviating?
I'm not aware overall, I am aware of examples, and I think the Yazidi one is extraordinary because it's a very huge cultural shift that challenges taboos and stigma at the extreme. And it was required that the top leadership in the holders of those values and custodians needed to make a pronouncement, and that made all the difference. I think perhaps it can be aligned with things like Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela made that lead and said that, you know, we can do it this way, and some of the things that have perhaps been done in Rwanda, where values of the culture are used to assist people to rejoin with those ideas. I think, you know, ideas of things like Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy of, you know, I am because you are, and that connection of spirit, mind, body, whole, and the integration of those things, looking at the strengths and values of that, and that being embraced. That was used in South Africa. It was also being used in some programs in Botswana. So perhaps there's parallels with those things. And I was recently had the privilege of visiting Chile. It's the 50th anniversary after Allende was assassinated and the rise of Pinochet, and of course all of the disappearances that happened at that time. Lots of art exhibitions and a whole building around truth and reconciliation, looking at the history and how it impacts people now and how that impacts moving forward. So a whole society examination. So I think some of those things are attempted and important, and there obviously needs to be a lot more focus on it. I'd really like to know more about it myself.
Thank you. Might move on to the next question, which I think maybe if we can start with you, Laura. And it reads, I note that the TF, CBT and writing exposure were delivered in groups as opposed to individual sessions. Could you please clarify this, and perhaps is this because it is a much better approach for collectivist communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's and link back to one of the previous questions too about what written exposure. Typically, it is done individually, and normally you'd have a session. When we spoke to community and the practitioners in Afghanistan, there was much more, we'd rather do it as a group. And so they come together, they get the instruction, then they write. And there is no expectation that the young person shares it with the group. The story is not shared. The story is not even shared to the facilitator, unless the young person wants them to. So it's much more, it's done individually, but it's within the group. And I guess that was the preference. Even when the study we just did in Iraq, there was much more a preference that I'm bringing my friend along, or I want to do this. I'd much rather do it with someone there rather than on my own. And the other reason was to try and keep it low resource, so we could actually roll it out. And there's work being done with some of the collaborators now. We're actually rolling out through some of the universities in Afghanistan as well. So it's being able to get further reach as well. But yeah, it was done individually, the actual task, but within a group setting. But none of the exercises were engaging the others around them, except sort of activities like Jeanette was saying, sort of like getting the young people to be engaged in art and that to start with and at the end, but the actual process of the writing was individual.
Thank you, Laura. There's another question coming from Laila Quedat, which I'd like you both to comment on, which is what approach differences might we take on how this impact bicultural, third cultural people, people, you know, from mixed cultures, as opposed to people from one culture? Laura, would you like to comment first? And I know this is it is a really interesting question, because so many of our clients actually come from mixed marriages, you know, and maybe one of the reasons behind the persecution, and many of the children, particularly, you know, and many adults that we're working with have grown in a country of asylum, and have acquired also some of the cultural, I suppose, aspects of the culture of the place they grew up, and they are being acculturated into Australian society.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, we all have lots of identities and lots of cultural identities. It's actually very hard to even define what culture is because we switch between them. It's quite a fluid thing. Also, how people internalize culture, which comes back to a previous question too, differs. You can't just say that all people from this culture have the same. So how people have internalized it, what cultural values they hold, and then we've got different cultures, they're all going to merge together. I think it becomes complex, and I'm not sure I have an exact answer to this. And I guess it is exploring it with the client and actually talking and actually spending time exploring different and how they all come together in one sort of how it represents within their identity and how it impacts on how they're feeling and their recovery. And it's actually talking to clients about, I was working with a Aboriginal client last year, and she was also queer. And I remember saying, oh, should we talk about this part of your identity? And the response was, no, I'm fine with that. But what I want you to talk about is this part of my identity. And what are you doing? Let's get on with this. And so it's actually letting them guide to what aspect of identity, and not me having my assumptions of what their identity or what part of their culture or how it's a strength or how it's a challenge as well.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Janet, would you like to comment on this one?
Yeah, I really like all those points that Laura has made. And I think that we have a different way of thinking about this, perhaps with the broader Australian culture and the idea of identity, which is this individual claimed sense of self, and that deciding that, this is my identity, that is my identity. These are something that is really current ideas within our society, and that young people are grappling with, and it's part of the language that we now talk about, that identity of self. And it is about who I choose that I am. It's not who you think that I am. And it's something that I've not worked so much with our trauma clients in STARTS, but I think that young people in particular who are exposed to that element in their acculturation into Australian and all those Western currents of ideas, and then the pulls that come from their parents and expectations, there's a lot to work with in that area. And of course, we also have young people who've been raised by parents who've been impacted by war and trauma, and might still have ways of operating in the world that are influenced by fears and sense of safety and dangers that are informed by their life experience, raising those children, and those children are affected by that as well, in the way that they are able to present themselves. So, it's so complex. It cuts way across the work that we do in our agency. It cuts across into all sorts of areas of the helping professions. And the artistic and creative and forward thinking and visualization for the future options that are part of our contemporary lives.
Thank you. I got a follow-up question from Leila, actually, which extends this topic, and it reads: I'm also wondering, how do we incorporate understanding and treatment methods for neurodivergent, queer, other minorities from other cultures, where they might have experienced stigma and shame? And she adds that, thank you, this is so interesting, and I think this is something that we can all agree with. Laura, would you like to comment on this one?
I think it does link to the previous response, that it is very intersectional, very complex. And I think you're led by the client. Like, they will have these identities. The identities are fluid. And I did like what was previously said, that it is actually a Western way that we like to categorize little things. And one of my favorite quotes is like, we like little periodic tables and put people in little periodic tables. Where it is more fluid. And so I guess it is the next level, whether the neurodiverse, the queer community, and I guess it's spending time exploring with a client what their identity, where they want to go with it, what they want to discuss. Yeah, and again, I don't have a clear answer to it, I don't think, but that would be my thinking.
Thank you, Laura. And I think this is great in a way to end on that note, because there's so much more that we need to find out, we need to learn and continue to learn with our clients, which I think is been very clearly the message from you both on these last couple of questions. This is all we have time for today. I'd like to thank you both very, very, very much for a really interesting afternoon exploring the impact of culture on the work that we do. And I'd like to finish by encouraging everyone to please explore and consider joining us for our next masterclasses. We have a 4th masterclass on utilizing group therapy approaches to assist recovery of refugee children from their past experiences. So very much talking, taking up some of the topics that came at the end of the session. And the date of the next masterclass is the 25th of September. And we will be joined by Anthony Gleason, a clinical psychologist and the STARS presenter. The STARS presenter will be Marshall Siebert, who's a clinical psychologist, again, with a long history with STARS. So please check upcoming events in the training section of the STARS website. And what may even better, subscribe to a newsletter, updates by the website, and then you'll be sure to get all news associated with future clinical masterclasses, but also other events that we hold at STARS. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you all with us, and it's been such an interesting afternoon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.